I got to introduce the next speaker. And he's a very good friend of mine. In fact, we have known each other and have worked together towards the interest of wildlife for 60 years. Yeah, 60 years. I met Val in the fall of 1959 when I was 19 years old. I was in my room in Acadia Camp studying my second year of university, and I could hear this thumping and banging and somebody walking down the hall and clunking, and I got up and I looked out into the hall, and here's this guy, I'd never seen him before, walking down the hallway with this moose rack that was as wide as he was tall. And I followed him down, being a hunter myself, had never seen a moose like this, and introduced myself to Val, and he was busy trying to tuck the moose under his bed, which wouldn't fit. And we've run into each other a lot of times since then. And yesterday he gave me the task of trying to remember who he is and what he's about. But I fooled him. I said, give me some notes. He didn't. So you know what I did, Val? I went to Wikipedia. I found out where you were born in the Ukraine. Didn't say anything about both your parents being engineers, however, but they did say that you were educated in Germany, which was a real benefit and a blessing for both you and us and wildlife. Because what Val's been able to do is bridge the literature between Germany, which has got hundreds of years of wildlife management in their record, to North America. He was able to interpret books that were written by German hunters who had come to British Columbia to tell us about what was going on here. And he's been well known for that. He's a couple years older than me, so he might be getting a little bit forgetful, but he holds an honors degree in Bachelor of Science in Zoology and a PhD from UBC, and he worked under Ian McTaggart-Cowan, the same prof that I had. In 1977, he started teaching at the University of Calgary, where he founded the first program of the environmental sciences in the Faculty of Environmental Design, which was a graduate student school, not just an undergrad school, it was a grad school. He spent 27 years there. I can say more and more about him, except that I know that he's written about 17 books, so it would take me a long time to tell you. But the guy's got experience in animal behavior and the kind of things I was talking about, the social well-being, the social dynamics of ungulates, in moose, white-tailed deer, in antelope, in sheep, all 4 subspecies, mule deer, white-tailed deer, buffalo. Did I miss any? All the ungulates. He's had experience in all of them. And he's a hell of a teacher. So Val, I will also say sadly that Val lost his partner, Renata, 4 years ago. That hasn't slowed him down. He's still writing, still working, and living on Vancouver Island. I consider him one of the most valuable wildlife managers alive today. Val.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had the privilege of listening to a practitioner who is one of the brightest on the continent and who is, while he's still alive, an absolute unbelievable source of important knowledge. I can only augment some of the things that he has been saying, but these are important augmentations. And to begin with, I would just like to show you what wildlife populations were like when I was a young man, when I began my career as a hunter and as a student of wildlife. December 23rd, 1958, one day before Christmas. Early morning, I'm lying on top of a snow cornice overlooking a slope down below, and I'm looking for a very, very large bull moose that is below me. A mile and a half away sits my friend Michael Steinle. He has a spotting scope, and he is counting the moose that are on the slope. Michael Steinle, by the way, became the number one man in the bureaucracy of the Bavarian Forest Service. He's still alive, he's 86 at the present time. And what Michael was counting was 36 moose on that hillside, of which 14 were bulls. I collected the largest one, and that is the bull that Ray was speaking about, that he saw me drag down the hall and tried to stuff under my bed. It had the 52-inch spread, and it was one of the best one out of 250 taken in Wells Grey Park. And it's also the best one I've taken because all other moose I've killed for the pan, for the pot, and not for the antlers. It is the day before this happened, Michael and I arrived at a small cabin that belonged to Ted Helseth, who trapped there for beaver in springtime. And we made a short foray towards that very hillside, and I counted 19 bulls. I didn't shoot any of them because they were not large enough for me at that point. And I was privileged later on in 1959 to become a student employee of the park, and again in 1960. And it was a very important experience in the following sense, that we had a park that was very, very, very much inhabited by grizzly bears. But they were grizzly bears that were extremely well behaved. Extremely well behaved, outstandingly well behaved. I know because I worked later on in Banff National Park. And the question, of course, arose, how is it possible that you can live in Wells Grey Provincial Park in 1959, 1960? You hardly see the grizzly bears, you see the tracks, they're everywhere. And why are they not in any way, shape and form visible? I'm an animal behaviorist. I've studied animal behavior, but I've also studied human behavior. And the most likely answer is that in 1959, 1960, in that park, there were, first of all, no hikers. Now, it's very hard to imagine today a landscape that is without recreational hiking activity. But in those days, there were no hikers. I met, in fact, only one hiker. He was a school teacher from Vancouver who had worked in Clearwater. And I was quite amazed to find him up high on the mountain, and we discussed things that day. The only people that grizzly bears met routinely were guides, outfitters, hunters, biologists, trappers, prospectors, and the important thing about all of us, we carried guns. Now, there is something about the way in which a human being behaves when they have a firearm in hand, when they are secure, and when they don't seem to be worried about what may happen to them. Which is in quite a bit of contrast to human beings that go into national parks, which are disarmed, which are moving along trails, which are afraid, which are then behave in a very peculiar manner when they meet grizzly bears. They don't feel emboldened in any way, shape, and form. In fact, there's an old joke. How do you distinguish between black bear poop and grizzly bear poop in national parks? Well, it's easy. The grizzly bear smells of pepper and has little bells in it. And that tells you something about national parks, because in national parks, it's the only place where I have been treated by a grizzly bear, where my students have been treated by grizzly bears, where grizzly bears came in and destroyed it almost routinely, some of the things that we set up for measuring instruments. None of that problem ever existed outside the national parks itself. In other words, within the national parks, the animals were very, very well acquainted with humans and were afraid of them and acted accordingly. And what that led to is something that most people don't really know, is that these parks, Jasper and Banff particularly, became black holes for grizzly bears. Studies have been made and published in the scientific literature which show that the number 1 and number 2 killing spot for grizzly bears in North America was Lake Louise and Banff National Park. Trophy hunters take note. Where were the grizzly bears killed primarily? Where the environmentalists were most active, because they were afraid of grizzly bears. And grizzly bears responded correctly. and they were killed for it. So one of the lessons that comes out, if you are bold, and you are bold when you carry a gun, that's subconscious. Everything will move away from you. And grizzly bears and wolves and so on are very, very sensitive, very intelligent animals. They give you a wide, wide, wide berth. And that has been everywhere the case except where people are disarmed. Now, I'll take you to another spot in British Columbia. It's September 15th, 1961. We are in the Spatsizi. We are on the south end of Coldfish Lake, where a cabin of Tommy Walker existed. And I am there with my newlywed wife, Renadelchen, and we have left our cabin at Gladys Lake, and now we're going to go up the Spatsizi Plateau in the early morning. We top out on the plateau, and we're looking across, and we're separated by a small canyon from the other side. And on the other side is a herd of caribou bulls, which is about 250, 300 yards across. It is a milling mass of bodies, and the antlers form literally a moving wall in front of us. How many of you have seen that? You see, this is a phenomenon, the gathering of the bulls, that occurs ever so often in large populations of barren ground caribou. Now, the Osborne caribou, which were in front of us, because in that corner of the province there are no mountain caribou, there are Osborne caribou, which are the large caribou, which are a derivative of the barren ground caribou, in fact. We saw the gathering of the bulls. Nobody quite knows why it happens, but it does happen. But the important thing is it shows you something about the numbers of animals that were in that area. I spent studying mountain sheep, mountain goats, and caribou, moose occasionally, in the Spatsizi. I spent there 2 years at Gladys Lake in isolation. My next door neighbors were two tall tent families 40 miles away, and they told me that in case I wanted to go to the next town, it was up that mountain, 135 miles, it was Telegraph Creek. And of course, I thought then that I was looking at something that was pristine. I thought I was looking into real Canadian wilderness. How could it be otherwise, etc., etc. The reason I was there, in part, was for a political move to get the Spatsizi set aside as a provincial or possibly national park. And ultimately, we succeeded, of course, as you well know. In fact, my study area of stone sheep became the second largest ecological reserve in British Columbia, signed out by Dr. Ian McTaggart-Cowan, Professor Krajina, and myself. So we were deeply involved at that time in setting the Spatsizi aside as something spectacular, absolutely spectacular. My God, I'm still remembering the rows and rows of female caribou coming up the creeks and then going up into the mountains in order to bear their calves there. Large caribou with large antlers, because this, as I said, females have large antlers in Osborne caribou. And it was something that, of course, stuck with me for the rest of my life. Now, I had students, of course, and about 15 years later, I think it was, one of my students was interested in continuing her work with caribou, with Osborne caribou, and they made a very thorough flyover looking for caribou. The results were very disappointing at that point, because very few caribou were found, but the most striking thing about that overflight was that they recorded a pack of wolves that counted 43 individuals. That's a super pack. Well, I have not visited the Spatsizi since, but I have kept track of it. And 3 years ago, some colleagues from Port Alberni went on a trip into the Spatsizi. They rode for 3 weeks on horseback through that countryside, they did not see a single head of big game. The only thing they saw that still reminded them that game had been in that area were the large number of antlers which were white, bleaching in the sun and rotting away. But not a single head of big game they saw. Another one also went to the Symposium with a hunting license. In 14 days, they saw 2 stone sheep, of which one was a decent ram, and he collected it. So what has happened? Because what we really have in front of us is a change from a wildlife paradise to a wildlife desert. What happened along that line? Well, I think the polite statement is that we are dealing with a predator pit situation. I say this is polite because this is sort of a roundabout way of admitting that predation is an extremely important factor when it has been released, and the predators were released. There's some history behind it. And the important thing is that we had here government agencies looking after a piece of land. They were protecting it, and they thought they were doing the very best. And they thought that protecting it would retain the qualities that it had. After all, that's the reason why we all wanted it to have set aside, because it was such a spectacular piece of land. Why did it not remain spectacular? What happened? There was no shortage of goodwill here. The people in charge were doing their job. And we are dealing here with a phenomenon that is extremely widespread in the environmental community. It is a phenomenon of protectionism. The belief that if you just simply step aside, the belief that if you let nature alone, all will be well, nature is all wise, if we interfere, we only do evil, so the best thing to do is just simply keep your hands off and stand away, and all will be well. The trouble is, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what it is not. Now, some interesting data has emerged on this whole notion of protectionism out of the United States. The United States National Park Service has sort of admitted in a little way, and this may disappear from their websites, by the way, that the national parks of the United States, in all these decades of protection, have been losing biodiversity. That's another very polite way of saying that native species in national park, under the policy of protection, are going extinct. That's the loss of biodiversity. At the same time, they noticed that the national parks have been home to invasive species. Foreign species that have gone in and under the cloak of being protected have spread and multiplied. How many? 6,500 species of invasive plants and animals in the US national parks. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not nature conservation. That is a scandal. In other words, if you do what the great gods of the environmental movement dictate, stay away, do not use your hands, do nothing. What happens? The sensitive native species go downhill and foreign invasive species take over. That's logical. After all, nobody's interfering with them, are they? Now, of course, I'm corresponding with people that are very much concerned with that, and there are some of these people are not willing to sit back and moan and groan. There are people that have a penchant for doing something about it. Here, I'll tell you one. This is Mark van der Post in California, and he has a website called the Wildergarten, which is a German word, Wildergarten, which means wild garden. And what Mark did 29 years ago was to buy himself 14 acres of California, of 14 acres of wild land. 14 acres. He counted on that land approximately 60 species of plants, native and non-native. And then he went to work. He wanted to restore native species. He wanted to bring out of the seed beds in the soil what was still available. In 29 years, after 29 years of hard work, he has 285 native species and 135 non-native species. From 60 species to over 380 species. Now, to me, that man is a hero. First of all, that kind of work could never be done anywhere on public land. You need private land for that. You need the ability to go and exert yourself totally. And please notice how he returned biodiversity. He brought it back with spade and plow at times, with power saws, with fire, and that's what you have to do. And he was extremely, extremely successful. This is an incredibly important lesson. Now, the national parks responded by saying that, well, we are losing biodiversity because we are not big enough. We have to be bigger still. All the thousands of square miles that are there. Now, how big do you have to get before you get some sort of a semblance of a continuity? Well, let's go to Wood Buffalo National Park. We still have bison there. Oh, they've been going up and down, I know. We've got wolves there. They've been going up and down. About 100, 150 wolves, 1,500, 2,000 buffalo, roughly. Do you know how big Wood Buffalo Park is? It's bigger than Switzerland. Is that what you have to do to maintain natural biodiversity? And in that case, look at what Wildergarten did with 14 acres. Now, these are very, very pungent lessons. The intellectual quality of the environmental community is under question, to say the very least. In fact, I consider them to be intellectually very deficient. And one of the best examples in which I am involved up to there is the wolf issue, both in the United States and in Europe. The EU signed a very silly treaty, silly because they signed away their rights to control wolves completely. And I don't know, we do know as biologists that if you have a few animals now and you protect them, you may get a large number of animals later. What you're going to do then? And that is the problem that they've run into now. Now, the greatest densities of wolves in the world right now are in central Germany, in Saxony. And these wolf populations now are increasing at the rate of 35% a year. It's absolutely against the law to harm these wolves. And some of the absurdities that have been developing, of course, wolves are not very good when it comes to traffic, so there are quite a few traffic fatalities. Enough so that the Germans developed special vehicles with facilities, first aid facilities, to drive along the Autobahn and pick up wolves that have been hit and are being then restored again by veterinarians. One German hunter who dared to kill a wolf that was badly injured was fined in court about it. Absurdities that it's hard to believe are happening, such as the gunfire by hunters now in Saxony attracts wolves, and they come and take away what the hunter has killed. So some hunters have now quit hunting because of that. All of this is happening despite the fact that there's an enormous amount of historical information about the behavior of wolves going back hundreds of years, written by people that experienced it, written by people who suffered through everything, and that is being systematically ignored. Well, at times we try to find out why this happens, but in North America I found the answer, which also was which previously had been discovered by a Russian scientist, and that was that in the 1950s, 1960s, a group of young biologists started studying wolves. They kept some wolves, and they were very greatly enamored by the behavior of the young wolves under 18 months of age. And they had really very little experience with wolves at the time. When people asked them, well, how do you rate the historical literature? Well, they couldn't rate the historical literature. They didn't have enough experience. But they couldn't admit that in public, so they said, oh, the historical literature are just good tales. Now they were off the hook. They didn't know other languages anyway, so that would have been a difficulty. But the important thing is they did not know enough about wolves to judge the historical literature, and they dismissed the historical literature. So in other words, we have here a situation that is alien to scholarship and to science. Totally alien. There are tales concocted about wolves. But when we do come in, like myself, for instance, and have tried to set the record straight, what the German audience are being told is, ignore Geist, because he's too old. At any rate, there is, in other words, an enormous intellectual deficit, which is not only prevalent, but is being defended, in fact. And the Greenies are basically saying that we are right and you are wrong. We're going to go ahead with our policies regardless. And I am, of course, a European. I've been through communism. I've been through Nazism. The behavior of these individuals is very, very similar to those of the communists, of the fascists, and of the Nazis. And in East Germany, we had a wonderful little example of a ditty that I told to my colleagues here in the last few days. The East Germans were singing a song to the effect, the party is always correct, and he who doesn't believe it is either stupid or vicious. Die Partei, sie hat immer recht, und wer es nicht glaubt, der ist bös oder schlecht. That's in German. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is what the Greens are doing today. We've lost the civility of discourse when that is happening. And we must go to the middle ground and regain it, like it or not. We must get back to science and to scholarship in these matters. I have another little example that bothers me somewhat, which happens to be the Marine Mammal Treaty, which has become so successful that we have now a surfeit of seals, of sea lions, and slowly but surely we're getting it also of whales. There's a great brouhaha made about orcas, as you have obviously heard, and the solution to some of the problem appears to be to reduce the fisheries as much as possible, not only to those who make a living for it, but also to sportsmen. So right now, where I'm living and where I have fished for the longest time in the marine environment, we are down now to 1 rockfish a day in the bag limits. Ladies and gentlemen, it isn't worth going fishing anymore. When you have that sort of a limitation taking place, where we that go out can sit in a boat, catch a fish, and what do we do then? When it isn't worth anymore going out, then there is a very real problem with our allocations. I'm thinking also that Dr. Suzuki spoke how much fun it was when he visits Haida Gwaii and his relatives there, that they are on the seashore and that they're eating lingcod and salmon and so on. They caught, well, of course it is. And he said, this is life as good as it gets. And I agree with him. That is life as good as it gets, to be outside and so on and so forth. But when you reduce the amount of fishing, you are also making it less likely that people will go out and enjoy that very life that Suzuki claims is so good about it. We must not forget that hunting and fishing and the whole of wildlife conservation, it does have a function. It does have a function, amongst others, to maintain human beings. When we get statistics, like out of Yellowstone Park, that a wolf on average during a year kills something like 22 elk a year. Now picture yourself 22 elk. They wouldn't fit on this place here. 22 elk on the front lawn, yeah. That is the cost of one wolf in Yellowstone. And the wolves leave areas affected when the kill rate drops to 16 elk per wolf per year. Now those 22 elk are winter meat for 22 families. And that is the real cost that we have to look at. And you are suffering at the present time a deficit. And I know that from Vancouver Island, where I'm living, where after the wolves, which came island hopping, spread and diversified in the 1970s, the kill of black-tailed deer dropped from about 25,000 to about 2,000. When I was doing my studies on mountain sheep, bighorn sheep in Banff National Park, there were about 2,500 elk. After the wolves returned, and there had been no wolves while I was studying mountain sheep in Banff, after the wolves returned in the 1970s, the number dropped to 300 or less. And the behavior changed. The elk were no longer visible. The moose disappeared. But the elk quit bugling. Now on Vancouver Island, elk do not bugle. There's too much of a predation pressure. I went hunting with a friend of mine for black bears, and we sighted during our hunt in May 46 bears, 1 deer. The deer are in Vancouver Island, virtually all in the cities, in the suburbs, and around farms, because that's where they have some security from predation. At any rate, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very real problem with wolves, but the most absurd thing to me is that if you introduce wolves into settled landscapes, as the Europeans have been doing, as the United States has been doing, you condemn the wolf ultimately to genetic extinction via hybridization. And dogs and wolves, although they have similar genomes, but then, ladies and gentlemen, so have human beings and chimpanzees. Wolves and dogs, which have similar genomes, are very different animals. And the degradation of the genome of the wolf is a very real reality, and the real wolf, in time, disappears and becomes merely a feral dog. In other words, what the environmentalists today are pushing through with law and order, etc., is very detrimental to the wolf. In fact, they are causing its extinction. The legislation in the United States will ensure that the whole continent will be coy wolf. Now, the coy wolf is a word for the hybrid between the wolf and the coyote and the dog. And it's about 60% wolf, 30% coyote, and 10% dog at the present time. That is unresolved. That is something not being looked at. So I am trying to fight for the real wolf. The real wolf belongs into the wilderness areas. He does not belong into settled landscapes at all. If you ask me what some of the things we have to do, then the first thing I would say today is no more national parks. The Okanagan National Park, I will not support. But all that we are doing there is we are giving land away for further degradation to a policy of do nothing. What we have learned, if anything, out of our review is that in order to maintain biodiversity and productivity, we can only do it via hands-on management. And hands-on management with plow, with spade, with axe, with power saw, with gun, with net, and poison if necessary. That is what we have to do. which is precisely what we cannot do in those so-called protected areas. These protected areas, in the long run, are destined to become wastelands. So the most important thing we can do right now is to resist the protectionism that is taking place everywhere. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have said enough at the present time. You see where my mind is at, and I am involved in the wolf issue on, and in a few days I'll be flying to Germany to another conference where we'll be facing up again to the challenges that have been provided by our friends, the environmentalists. Thank you.